My name is Karolina Czeczek. Thank you so much for showing up. I definitely did not plan to present to so many people, so I'm a little bit intimidated. Last time I was here, I was in a seminar with Karolina, where I really presented something. So 8 years fast forward, I'm here presenting as faculty, but I hope the presentation is kind of useful for you as students, but also faculty is something that grew out of my personal interest, became research, but by no means it's a kind of research on a PhD level or proper research, you know. I think it's something that kind of organically became first kind of an interest, then a little research project, then an exhibition, maybe hopefully a book, and we'll see. And as much as I'm kind of presenting today to you, I would actually really appreciate not only questions, but also suggestions of how you would see this to continue. I just got a kind of grant to continue working on it, so I will be working on it for next year at least, and any kind of suggestions would be helpful. This is the website that I made that you can preview after the talk, and it features a lot of information that I gathered for the research. But what I'm going to show you is a proper presentation here. Okay, so for those who don't know me, probably most of you, as I said, my name is Karolina. I'm a critic at Yale School of Architecture. I also went to school here. I did the postgrad program from 2013 to 2015. And I'm originally from Poland, where I got my first degree. Then I worked for 4 years at OMA in Rotterdam and in Hong Kong. Then I came back to school here at Yale, and then I, together with my partner Adam Frampton, started a practice in New York called Only Architecture, and that's what I'm continuing to do now. I'll very quickly flip through things we're doing in the office, but just to show you that we're doing different scales, and both teaching and public pools, which is a research that I'm also working on, is a kind of added on to what we do as a practice. So just without further ado, we as a small office started working on kind of smaller scale kind of competitions and interventions in the city. We did not win any of those, but it was a kind of good exercise for us to get into kind of practicing architecture. Then we realized a couple of small interiors in the city. This one is still existing. This one kind of died during the pandemic, but we kind of continued to build as a kind of way to also learn how to do it. We did a very big project for senior affordable housing that unfortunately did not get built, but it was a good kind of exercise in understanding kind of housing conditions and city regulations. We then won a Big Ideas for Small Lots competition. That was a city organized competition to build affordable housing on infill lots, and affordable housing and housing in general. It's a kind of large part of our practice. I also teach with Tatiana Bilbao advanced studios and summer workshops that have to do with housing. So I'm connecting in a way what I'm doing in the office and here at the school. And then we actually realized one of this is our first ground up project, which is a narrow house. It's a house on a 13-foot wide lot. Not unlike one of those lots from the competition that we finished 2 years ago. And it's very much also related to a kind of research, that it's a kind of second arm of our practice where we explore topics that are very much kind of dear to us or interesting to us. And in this specific case of irregular development, we mapped all the irregular, narrow, triangular, sometimes not buildable as per zoning lots, and then show all of them, and then created 9 prototypes of affordable housing projects. One of those being this house that later on realized. It's our own house, so we acted both as a kind of developer and architect and client and everything together. Not sure if I recommend that, but it was a good exercise for us. And then our other research projects relate to kind of public space. We also recently did a kind of big model for the M+ Museum in Hong Kong that maps all the public spaces in a city and kind of represents them as this kind of skeleton without showing the topography in the building. So this is different types of scales we work in the office, but as I mentioned, the research part, the teaching part, it's very important for us to kind of bounce off the ideas or bounce off the kind of projects we are not yet able to realize as an office through teaching, and vice versa. So I think both academic and kind of practicing side is important to us. At the same time, both architecture and urbanism are very important to me specifically, but also comes through practice. I somehow, maybe it's through my initial education in Europe, where urbanism is kind of very much interconnected with architecture, and it's kind of considered, architecture is always considered as part of urbanism. Urbanism is made out of architecture. I always think about those two as a kind of connected, and I think hopefully that comes across in the kind of full research that I'm going to be showing and focusing next. So I never planned to do that research. It really just came out of my own personal interest. Initially, after graduation, I spent summer in Poland waiting for my visa. And there was a small call for young architects to do a proposal to renovate a selected public space in Warsaw. And I completely randomly came across this abandoned complex of public pools in Warsaw and proposed to renovate it, bring it back to use. Became a finalist of that competition. Didn't win it, but somehow the topic or kind of thinking about those spaces stayed with me. And then when 2 years later, in 2017, I was asked by a former faculty member, Ed Mitchell, who became chair at the Cincinnati School of Architecture, invited me to teach visiting studio and a seminar. I decided, well, this pool topic is kind of interesting. I might as well just explore it through the seminar. And for 2 years, I taught a seminar called The Story of the Pool. So I stole title from Rem Koolhaas's essay in Delirious, New York. I recommend highly everyone to read the essay. It's in Delirious, New York. It's also on the website publicpools.com. First, it was 2 years. So first year we looked at water infrastructure. We looked at bathing culture around the world. So we looked how kind of religious rituals, recreational aspects of water kind of re-emerged or shaped architecture, but also urban spaces. And that was super interesting. I learned a lot. Hopefully students learned a lot too. The second iteration next year, I did the same, but then half of the semester we actually decided to focus on New York City pools, and we started, students selected pools in New York City to redraw them, kind of trace the history, both in terms of architecture, but also policy under which they were created. And that I actually continued that on my own after finishing that seminar. So seminar allowed me to read enough to understand what the kind of big scope of that topic is. And I very much became focused on public pools in New York City, of course, in light of a kind of large pool infrastructure, in different parts of the world. So I basically continued to map all the pools existing in New York City. During the pandemic, I kind of voluntarily offered to write 3 articles for Urban Omnibus on that topic. But it was actually a very good exercise for me to start kind of systematizing all the knowledge that I kind of gathered and more that I had to gather to write them. And I'm not sure why I'm interested in public pools. I'm generally interested in public infrastructure. I think it might have to do with coming from Europe, especially Eastern Europe, where public facilities, public infrastructure is very much part of daily life. It's something you use you use. I mean, I went to public pool in my hometown every summer quite a lot. I was also a swimmer. So it was very much something that I was aware of and always looked for in the kind of summer. But I never really came across public pool in New York City, and by 2017-18, I already lived there for a couple of years. And that might have been just my ignorance. But when I started looking for the pools, indeed they're there. There's actually quite a lot of them. But there is a kind of interesting history behind their location, behind their size, etc. So aside from a kind of series of articles, or as part of those articles, I also decided to kind of zoom out and think of the pools as a kind of endpoint of a larger infrastructure, which is water infrastructure. And I try to kind of trace, it wasn't that hard, it's very much available information, but retrace where the water in New York City comes from. You know, what's the cleanliness of the water, you know, how the distribution looks like, and what are the kind of endpoints. So probably many of you know that New York City water is actually very clean. It comes from the series of reservoirs that are then funneled down to the city through a series of aqueducts, and then the water that you get in the hydrant, the water that you get in the water in your tap, the water you get in the pool, it's pretty much the same, relatively clean water. It doesn't need, of course, in the pool they clean it during the season, but you're pretty safe drinking from the New York City hydrant. And that's a kind of advantage that New York City has. Of course, to do that, I had to look at the kind of older maps, kind of sanitary maps that traced reservoirs that existed in New York City prior to the kind of system we have right now. There were a series of collection ponds before we even had an aqueduct system. There were a series of cisterns that were used during fires, and that was what water system looked until half of the 19th century. But then with the introduction of the Croton Aqueduct, which is on its own an amazing kind of engineering and architectural element, and there are many drawings that are like accessible publicly online and through library, and it basically kind of recreated a little bit of a kind of Roman system of how the water gets from a kind of further out of the city into the city, and how it basically ends up in individuals' apartments. It worked it worked quite well. Of course, at that time, not everybody had access to running water in their houses, but for kind of city operations, sanitary kind of reasons, it was a big upgrade in the city. Here are some drawings showing moments where water infrastructure doubles as a recreational infrastructure. So this is High Bridge that it's still existing, and it's a pedestrian bridge across Hudson River. It's a kind of bridge that carried the old Croton Aqueduct pipe, but also, as you see on the right, it was pedestrian promenade, a kind of element that was used for recreation. And in the kind of top right, you can see High Bridge Reservoir that was used to store the water and then further distributed throughout the city. There are two more reservoirs. One of them was a York Hill Reservoir, which is basically now the Great Lawn in Central Park. That's on the left. It's filled in, the rectangular parts. And if you're ever in New York City Public Library and Bryant Park, that's where Murray Hill Reservoir was. And if you go into the basement of the New York City Public Library, you actually see the foundations of that reservoir still being there. And you can also see that the reservoir, again, doubled as this kind of like recreational feature where you could go up and walk its walls, kind of having a different view and perspective on the city. This is another drawing I prepared to show an overlap of a historical and then contemporary water infrastructure. And this is the High Bridge Reservoir that I was just showing, that in 1936 became a High Bridge pool. And you can see a little bit of the High Bridge itself with the old Croton Aqueduct pipe. You can see the new Croton Aqueduct pipe. There's now a third aqueduct that brings the water into the city. But for me, what was important is this kind of water infrastructure that kind of builds on its own and kind of continues to provide water, but at the same time, recreation to people in that neighborhood. Then I'm a big fan of mapping or cataloging, and there's a little catalog here that I also printed, so we can pass around. It's pretty much this, but on individual pages. I, in a very simplified way, drew all the public pools in New York City. There's roughly 64, 65, not all of them are open every year, some of them under renovation, but I think 65 is the total count. And they look nice, they're kind of create a cloud of different shapes and sizes, but that was actually what I became a little bit more interested in, is like why there's such a range of sizes, why there's such a range of shapes, and what it is connected to, right? So I started to organize those pools according to their size or according to the times where they were built, and that's where actually bigger story came about the kind of policy around public space and policy about pools specifically. And given my kind of interest in both architectural features that I will show a little bit later, but also kind of urban fabric and how it's shaped and how policy shapes that kind of fabric, and then architecture was a kind of very interesting entry point. So New York City had a series of floating pools in the rivers at the end of the 19th century. They kind of doubled as public baths. As I was saying earlier, not everybody had access to running water. In kind of pretty densely inhabited city, kind of still pretty industrial city at the time, access to water or physical hygiene was very important. So those pools existed in the both Hudson and East River. However, given the river cleanliness or actually lack of thereof, they were closed, and a series of public bathhouses that were indoor were built in New York City. Those are the ones that are remaining, but there were, I believe, like 13 or more or so of them that were spread mostly throughout Manhattan. There are a couple in Brooklyn, and they were kind of advertised throughout the city as a kind of free public baths. Again, they were technically recreational facilities, but they also had laundry facilities, they had showers, they had sinks, they were basically places where you could go and clean yourself, clean your clothes, but also then recreate. And many of those are still existing as buildings. They're not always pools or recreational facilities, although some are still working like that. Some of them were adapted to other buildings. They're very kind of beautiful works of architecture, and I'm working with the photographer Anna Morgowicz to photograph all the New York City pools. I mean, we've done about half of them maybe. So public baths are one of the typologies, and then you will see later on we also photographed pools around the city. So after kind of public bath kind of era, in 1936. Huge pools were built in New York City. It was a time where, it was after the Great Depression, and it was during the time where work programs administration construction was basically happening around the country. And at that time, the Parks Department Commissioner was Robert Moses, we know him, and he secured a huge chunk of federal money to build public facilities. Not only pools, but pools somehow were for him a very big kind of point of interest. That was also the time of society becoming a little bit more modernized. I mean, idea of recreation was much more common. Prior to that, recreation was not necessarily part of daily life of everyone. But by 1936, there was a little bit more openness about the kind of mixing of gender, about recreating, about spending, free time, and it was more accessible to everyone in a city, given the kind of size of those pools. So there were 11 WA public pools that were built. They're still all open. Only one McCarran Park pool closed for a period of time, but it was renovated in 2008 and it's now working. The pools were humongous. This is Astoria pool at the day of the opening. They're way oversized, but they actually accommodate, I mean, they're probably not oversized for the amount of people that lives in the neighborhood, but they maybe lost a little bit of popularity because when you go there now, there is a lot of water in respect to how many people are using it. This year, this specific pool is closed. They're renovating the pool kind of the pool brand itself. But you can see, what a kind of endeavor was to construct 11 of such huge facilities. Many of them were designed in kind of Art Deco style by Eimer Embury, and those drawings are also very beautiful, and many of them feature not only a pool but also indoor recreational center, which you can see on the right here, and many of those are still functioning as such until this day. Those are the photographs that we took, I believe in 2019. So that's the kind of weekday during summer. It's not very crowded. Weekends are much more crowded. The pool got renovated and parts of it got enclosed. So you can see the diving tower and diving pool that are like fenced off. New York City, due to security reasons, kind of banned diving towers, and that area is now fenced off. But luckily they preserved the tower itself, and the second kind of semicircle that was on the other side, it's turned into a playground. But pool is very much working. I had a chance to go under this pool. I was teaching a studio at Pratt where with students were adding indoor facilities to that specific pool, so we toured all the kind of filtration system, and it's pretty kind of interesting from the perspective of engineering as well, aside from the architecture. McCarran Park pool, which I mentioned earlier, got closed for a period of time, was abandoned for a while. There was even threat of demolishing it, but mostly thanks to artists and kind of dance groups that started to kind of use pool grounds for their rehearsals and then shows. It kind of came back to the public consciousness, and a series of concerts started to happen, I think until 2008, 2009, on the pool ground. So I haven't been to one of those, but the photographer I'm working with, she went to a couple of those, and it was apparently quite amazing place to do those. And then under Mayor Bloomberg's administration, the pool got funding and it was renovated in 2008. So it's now, again, a public swimming pool, and I believe ice rink in winter. So that's and we photographed a lot of those pools, but I'm not going to show you everything. What I want to talk about a little bit is the kind of difference in policy and approach to public building and public space making. So the WPR pools were built under Robert Moses, and they're kind of big in scale, kind of impressive in size, not unlike kind of Robert Moses' style of kind of governing. He was also known for flying over the city in helicopter. He was known for not necessarily very equal distribution of those public facilities throughout the cities and neighborhoods. But after his kind of stepping down from the Parks Department in the 60s, Mayor Lindsay, who is pictured among the kids on the picture on the right side, came with very different set of policies around public space and parks specifically. Pools are managed by New York City Parks. What's interesting, his Parks Department commissioner was Thomas Hoving, whose background was actually in art. He was previously a curator at Met Cloisters. So he was someone who very much kind of understood a kind of role of design, but also a role of design that is accessible to every person that lives in the city. And as part of the mayoral campaign of John Lindsay, he prepared, Thomas Hoving prepared a white paper that kind of reviewed all the parks existing in New York City and a kind of assessment of what could be done, what could be improved. Interestingly too, he also said that every public space building should be part of a kind of competition, that architects should be paid for that competition entry, and that kind of aesthetic qualities should be equal to kind of budgetary or engineering aspects of it. And I think that was a moment where a lot of discussion about city making was happening. John Lindsay is not kind of hiding the fact that he was very much impacted by Jane Jacobs, but it was also the time where there was kind of countrywide kind of discussions about civil rights. That's when the kind of housing desegregation happened, school desegregation, and it's really important to mention that schools were not accessible to everyone. It was not always a legal segregation, but it was what I would call a social segregation, where groups of white people would not want to swim with African American people or Hispanics, and there were fights at the pools of who can access it. Most of the time resulting with African American population or Hispanic not being able to swim, not being able to learn how to swim, and until today there's actually a much higher percentage of those groups with lack of ability to swim. So Mayor Lindsay's policies were also, of course, that also coincided with kind of suburban development. Also with technology development, where all of a sudden everybody got their house, got their lawn, got their backyard pool, and could swim there, kind of not necessarily using kind of public facilities in the cities. And this is a little graph that I actually prepared together with Nicolas Kemper, who is also he was my classmate, where we looked at construction of private pools, and you can see that there is basically this like huge rise of construction of private pools from 1960s that we try to argue in one of the articles that coincides, of course, with the kind of urban decline, kind of development of suburban development, but also a kind of desegregation or kind of legal desegregation of the schools, pools, and other facilities. So what Mayor Lindsay kind of proposed is, rather than to build a huge pools and the kind of humongous kind of works of architecture, to do kind of small kind of insertions in neighborhoods that don't have those facilities, that pools that can be actually folded for winter and kind of deployed again in the summer. And that also, you can see here in those pictures, happened on many times on the kind of empty lots, kind of abandoned properties that were not in use. Maybe not the most beautiful settings with like trees and shading, yet very, very needed kind of facility in those neighborhoods. They even came up with the kind of mobile pools that were literally kind of dumpsters on tracks that would drive around neighborhoods throughout the whole summer, and everybody could use them. Other than pools, Mayor Lindsay is known for pocket parks, kind of playgrounds, and smaller kind of interventions in the kind of streetscape that help both with cooling, but also with just kind of socializing, and especially for the neighborhoods that did not have street trees, that did not have access to public space, even tiniest park or a kind of small pool was a big change in the kind of upgrade for those. After the first tenure, which was building these tiny pools, then I guess the more funding was dedicated towards slightly bigger pools being constructed, and those are called best pocket pools. And you might know best pocket parks term. One of them is Pelly Park, next to like Fifth Avenue, but there's a couple more of those. And those pools were actually kind of prefabricated concrete modular systems. Usually they featured a larger swimming pool because the mini pools were not necessarily swimmable. It's really like about cooling. I think this pictured pool is actually bigger than the ones I'm drawing here. While those allowed for swimming, and so there was like a swimming part and a kind of wading part, and those little kind of pixels are either shading areas, changing areas, toilets, or kind of places where you can buy food or drink. There are a couple outliers around that time. You should look specifically at Kościuszko pool. This is my favorite pool in New York City. This is my neighborhood pool in New York City. I go there, Brenna goes there. It's super nice, but it's not super well maintained. It was built in the designed in the late 60s, built in the early 70s, and it was kind of a, I would say, gem among all the pools built during Lindsay's administration. Kościuszko. It's a coincidence, it's a Polish general name. But you can use K-pool or people pool. That's basically what people renamed it because the surname was too difficult to pronounce. So those are the kind of modular West Pocket Park pools. And you can see them throughout New York. Many mini pools did not survive. They got folded or they were temporary and they kind of disappeared. But the West Pocket Park pools are still there. And there was a kind of couple years ago a campaign to kind of invite again or kind of bring back the pools into the kind of public consciousness and a kind of initiative called Cool Pools, where they repainted some of them and created a series of programming during summer happened. And there are another kind of outlier in that series, it's Lasker Pool in Central Park, which actually by now is demolished. I believe we were like one of the last people to take pictures of it. It was oval, very kind of unusual shape for the pools in New York City. It's being renovated. It's being demolished, but it's being renovated, and there's going to be indoor part and outdoor part. However, I really enjoyed the kind of modern kind of roof and the shape itself, the steps, and it was very beautiful kind of setting within the park. So back to the Kościuszko pool. That's very interesting pool because it was it was designed by Morris Lapidus, who actually grew up in that neighborhood, I believe pre-war. And he was known by the time he was working on it in the late 60s as the designer of like lavish kind of hotels and pools in Miami. So like Fontainebleau. He actually is a designer of the Lincoln Road in Miami, if you know this little kind of urban structures, shading elements. But he was very much considered as a kind of designer of like luxury spaces and places, often kind of privately funded projects. I'm not sure if he was like a friend with Thomas Hoving or the mayor, but basically he was invited to design this pool in Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. A neighborhood that was very kind of dense without access to public space, and that's what he did. The pool is almost Olympic size, so it's quite big, but what's really beautiful about it that it's not only a pool, it has a series of kind of elevated decks, steps, it has the elevated playground, which I'll show you a little bit later, but you can see the top left picture where there's a whole area dedicated to play, and that play is kind of, it's not a playground as we know now, the kind of plastic elements, but it's really kind of forms and shapes and pipes that are kind of creating kind of, or inviting to play. Unfortunately, most of those areas are closed off because they're not ADA compliant, the steps are too high, there is no railing, so really since kind of 70s, the pool kind of, the parts of the pool that are in use are getting smaller and smaller, to a point where given the current shortage of lifeguards in New York City, only like 1/3 of a pool can be open at the kind of random day, just because that's how many people they have to kind of control, and there is ratio, of how many lifeguards has to be to how much square footage of water. There was a beautiful kind of waterfall and a slide and a kind of sculptural water splash that got removed. So that's the pool as of today. I think there are pictures from the times of the opening by Danny Leon, who photographed New York City in the 70s that show the kind of users. I guess the pool was not blue back then, but it's kind of showing how it sits in the kind of urban fabric. It takes almost whole city block in Brooklyn, so it's very big. I'm going to show you a video. So basically I did all of that I did a little booklet myself. I wrote a couple articles, and then we got an email from the curators at the MoMA, who were preparing, it was a year ago, preparing a show called New York City Republics that was featuring existing, but also just ideas for projects that had to do with public space, that had to do with public buildings, that had to do with public as people as well. And what was interesting, that show, not only featured big offices, big projects, commissions, but it also featured ideas, offices like ours, which, we don't have huge stuff built, but doesn't mean we don't have some good ideas. So it was very kind of nice to be part of it. However, I had research and like a bunch of drawings, as you saw, and beautiful photographs by Anna, and show called for a project. And I immediately knew the project would be the kind of renovation and extension or some sort of kind of reinterpretation of Kościuszko Pool. So we basically started to think about that as a kind of our entry to the show. As part of the show, we also worked with the videographer to create a kind of video of an existing condition of the pool. In many cases, projects in a show were already built. So video was about built projects. But what was important for me was to show the pool as is, whether it's used, whether it's not used, who are the users. On a random day, sound was very important. So I hope it kind of comes across. And I think it gives a very good kind of sense of what the pool is right now. This is a weekday. It used to be diving pool, then it was waiting pool, but now it's fenced off. The first apartment was not having diving. And this is the elevated playground that is also fenced off, and it's featured all these kind of like elements that we're supposed to be playing. So what's important to note that New York City pools are by now closed. They're open roughly like 10 weeks out of the year, which is very short given how long it is in New York City most of the time. They also used to be open longer, but by now they have much shorter operation times given the the shortage of lifeguards and other things. There's no night swimming, which was actually originally designed by Morris Lapidus for that pool. So in a way, like the city infrastructure is very kind of minimal used, and part of the argument that we were trying to make for the show is that a pool is, of course, it's a building, it's a swimming place, but it's also a place where community can meet, where people, go to hang out in the absence of other places to meet. People go to cool off, given also lack of like sometimes shaded spaces or even air conditioning. This is a place where people can go, and it's much more than just like a swimming or recreational area. We see young people, but there's elderly, there's kids, there's like rats, there's birds. I mean, not that I'm promoting rights here, but it's really a place where you can go read a book. There is a place you can, meet. When we photographed it and videotaped it, we actually met a couple groups that did not have much to do with swimming, but they were like reading groups that really it's a nice place to be. So we very much wanted to bring back that specific pool, but generally kind of idea about using the pool as part of the city infrastructure. So as part of the show, we showed the video, we showed the photographs, but then we also proposed a specific intervention. We also, this picture maybe doesn't show it best, but we made this a very big concrete model, which we made in our office ourselves. We basically 3D printed everything, then we poured, maybe better pictures of it. We poured this kind of silicone to make the negative, and then we poured the concrete part. And then all the new elements were made out of kind of aluminium that you can see on the right here. So idea was basically to kind of use as much of an existing pool grounds as possible, of course bringing it back to compliance, like make it safe for use. Some of the kind of playground areas could be adopted as a kind of little performance zones. Even the small wading pool on the kind of bottom left, it has basically a stage and has basically auditorium through the kind of steps. So we were really planning to bring that back. And then we also proposed to cover half of the pool because it's never really used in the kind of entirety, and covering it was actually kind of part of the original design. We discovered in original drawings that there were anchors designed to kind of attach the kind of seasonal cover of the pool. We also talked to Parks Department, current and the kind of former commissioners, who said the Parks Department actually studied covering some of the pool, but because of the maintenance costs, etc., did not decide to do it. But we proposed basically to take half of it and cover it in a somewhat maybe lightweight structure that then would extend potential use of the pool through the whole all year season, or at least the kind of shoulder season. And then there is a kind of small grayed out area, you can zoom in here, which is actually an empty lot. It's owned by HPD, which is a housing reservation department. But because of the restriction on height and potential overshadowing the pool, housing cannot be built there to a height that makes sense financially. So we proposed to transfer that lot to Parks Department and build an indoor facility, which it's partially a kind of swimming facility, has kind of physiotherapy, has smaller pools, has a kind of also places for different community groups to meet, that has a kind of sports field inside. It has a lifeguard training center, given the kind of shortage of that. And it connects through this kind of circular volume to the covered part of the pool. And there's also smaller interventions that have to do with how the water in the pool is cleaned. We propose to change the filtration system, although not super aggressive right now, to the natural filtration system, and kind of incorporating plants. Natural filtration basically uses plants and gravel and a kind of increasingly small kind of grain of kind of stone and other substances to clean the water as part of this cleaning system, but also kind of educational aspect of kind of incorporating green and a kind of planting into the pool. So this is where the whole project is now. The show closed last July or this July. As I mentioned, I'm now I got a grant to take it further. I would like to research more kind of details about the kind of specific policies and specific pools and their design, but I also actually attended a council member hearing in April this year in New York City because a couple council members in New York City put forward a bill or a kind of request to do a kind of review of all the pool facilities in the city because actually kids cannot learn to swim. It's not part of the school program. Not every neighborhood has a pool. There is a public kind of program to learn how to swim, but apparently spots are gone in like 4 hours after sign up starts. And there's very kind of acute need for kids to learn how to swim, but also for everybody, you know, to access kind of pool as a kind of facility. So as far as I know, there's no action taken yet, but given my kind of connection or previous discussions with Parks Department, I would also like to reach out and maybe, I don't know, I don't want to offer to work for free, but kind of work together in kind of thinking of how, you know, kind of learning a little bit from the past, kind of understand the kind of contemporary condition and then kind of planning for the future. I would of course love to be commissioned that project, but that's probably kind of another story if ever. But I'm just kind of very kind of fascinated in how the kind of personal interest became such a kind of big thing. And I will basically encourage all of you to kind of think of your current projects, even seminars, as something that you can carry through as you move on with working for someone or working for yourself or doing research projects. That's all for me. And thank
you. Do you ask any questions now?
Yes, or suggestions or criticisms. Welcome.
I guess. Oh, is there a mic? No, that's not really. Great.
No, I think it's okay.
No, thank you. Thank you, Karolina, for the presentation. It was really wonderful. I guess my question has to do with the kind of infrastructure that undergirds the pool infrastructure itself. And I'm really curious about, you know, whether your research has also maybe taken you to look more at the design of the municipal water supplies and the kind of different capital interests that exist within public utilities, because I was really drawn to that graphic that it showed about how the number of private pools were like, yeah. And I'm just kind of really curious about whether you see this trend towards a certain kind of privation of amenities being kind of also part and parcel of how the real estate market has shifted in the New York urban landscape. And, you know, how do you see public pools interfacing in a way with private pools?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of ongoing kind of dynamic between the kind of private and public, which I mean, it started or took off in like 60s and kind of, you know, suburban development and kind of, you know, development of lots of technologies to build individual pools, but then also like, you know, like kind of depopulation of cities, you know, in the kind of 70s, New York City went bankrupt, you know, at some point, like there was no even money to maintain many of the public facilities. Now, you know, cities are back on the map, like, just generally speaking, and I think there is actually increased interest in kind of public amenities. I mean, during pandemic, you know, they actually closed all the pools first because, you know, of the health conditions, but it was kind of proven or kind of argued that actually pools would not contribute to kind of, you know, increased kind of COVID cases. So some of them were reopened, but they need more funding. I mean, that's what I was saying, that maybe it's just my own kind of like subjective view that somehow when I'm in Europe, I'm always somehow aware of some public pool in, you know, town, or kind of it's part of the kind of public infrastructure. Not so much in New York, or maybe it's not so much talked about. And yes, I mean, there's all this glorification of like rooftop pools and like, you know, like clubs, you know, like also like country clubs, you know, like took away people from the public pools. Also, what was interesting, country clubs could set their own rules and they basically could segregate who can access a pool and who cannot access a pool. But since they were like private or like, you know, not individually owned, but like, you know, community-owned facilities, they could regulate that. So I think, you can go and, there's apps where you can go and find a rooftop pool, but then you have to pay. Public pools in your city are free. I mean, you have to follow certain rules. You have to bring your own locker. You should be in a white T-shirt. You cannot bring phone. You have to leave it in the locker. So sometimes, it's maybe discouraging. But it was discouraging me too the first time. But then I went once and I was like, oh, actually, it's very little threshold. So I think it's a matter of just using it, talking about it also as, a kind of project. In a kind of urban scale and kind of awareness of public infrastructures being as important as iconic buildings or museums, because I think that's where a lot of culture or it's, for me, water or pools are kind of connective tissue for people. It's less formal. It's also very interesting that it's very public space, but you're almost naked. So it's this kind of double kind of quality of the kind of publicness versus intimacy. But then also it's for me a kind of entry to a discussion about the kind of body image, how we kind of accept ourselves, as different types of bodies, different types of people, as a kind of society, and kind of are together in the same kind of pool of water. So I think yes, there is this dynamic going on, but I think especially with my or your generation, which is not that far off. There is a comeback. I see more and more people. I mean, Bedford Stuyvesant also now it's still relatively affordable. So there's a lot of young professionals moving in, and I see they're using the pool. There's a lot every year. There's more and more people coming. There's young families coming, and there are people who are coming there all along. So I think it's a kind of understanding. Maybe it has to do with also streets that are closed during pandemic, that we kind of have those spaces and we have to maximize the kind of public space. Also given the kind of small size of our apartments, and that's the kind of something we should care together for. And I think with that, city also would have funding for it. Sorry, long answer. But.
I'm interested in how far can the flexibility of the space be pushed. Because I was really interested in how you showed the image of when the pool was empty, didn't have water in it, and how the space could be used for other things. So my question is kind of two parts to it. First, what happens to the pools when they are closed? Are they completely drained and just emptied out, or are they used for other purposes? And how can we reimagine that space, mostly in a city like New York where space has such great value, and in the upcoming years cities will continue to grow. So how can that space be used for other purposes while it's not used as a pool?
Yeah. Great question and great suggestion. Pools are closed. They're locked up, and then the water is drained, and they will reopen in, I think, end of June next year. And the whole space is fenced off. This pool specifically, it's a kind of hub for all the parks workers who, clean the parks and streets. So it works kind of partially, but it's just for the facilities management, and other than that, it's just empty. But of course, there is an issue of the pool, the hole in the ground that you don't want to fall into. But with specifically such a big pool, there's architectural and other temporary ways to at least make parts of the pool accessible. As I was saying, it's almost like a natural outdoor theater, right? It's it's a place where you would definitely have parts dedicated to different activities throughout the year. I could see parts of it being turned into the kind of ice rink, but also, once you make it available to people, they will definitely come up with the ways of using it, and as you can see with the McCarran Park pool, it was closed, but people would break in and have their dance rehearsals there. And that literally started to kind of prompted people to think about why there is such a big empty pool sitting there, what else can be done there and how else can we use it. I almost feel like, I wish the Makarim Park pool was not turned back into one big pool, but it was maybe subdivided to different areas that kind of catered to different new programs. And I think in a way we cannot really afford of having those spaces being only like singular programs. They have to have, like double, triple, quadruple kind of ways of being used to maximize it. It's there. It's literally in the middle of like huge neighborhood. Like why not?
Yeah, it reminded me of this thing that happens, I think it's on the West Coast, called Parking Day, where they use parking spaces that are like completely emptied during the nights to have other purposes.
Yeah, I mean, of course it has to do with management and funding and all these things, but I mean, it's really a matter of policy and like thinking through how it really could work. Another thing is night lighting, I mean, it was designed, you can even still policy the lights that are broken since the 70s. There's always arguments about like crime and like issues, but I think, like if we do nothing about it, it's not gonna solve itself. So I think it's really, and I think it takes architects, it takes engineers, it takes policy, it takes all the people to kind of come up with a good solution. I don't think only policy is going to solve it or only architectural intervention is going to solve it. That's why I think I'm interested in kind of course, doing a proposal, but this is just one idea of how this pool could be renovated or done. I'm sure there's like 100 other ways, and if it ever gets done, like it's probably not going to look like that. But it's a kind of start of a discussion, and that discussion I want to have with you, the students, I want to have with the city, I want to have with people who go to the pool and propose their own ways.
I'm curious when you started this process and then how it's progressed, what the feedback from the Parks Department and other municipal partners have been, and if there has been some change in their attitude or resistance or...
So the former Parks administration who renovated the Makarim Park pool was very like supporting the idea, and they somehow recognized pools as important city asset. The current administration, I mean, of course, recognizes the importance of pools, etc. But this pool specifically, nobody knows what to do with. And there was actually a study done 10 years ago to demolish the whole pool and just build a kind of small recreation center and turn the rest of it into a park. I mean, aside from like aesthetics did not look I thought it's a kind of maybe waste of resources that are already existing. I understand sometimes maybe it's harder to renovate and build from scratch, but
Yeah, I have a second question that's kind of related to that, which
so they don't have a plan for it. I mean,
Yeah.
they have barely enough money to like repaint it and kind of reopen it every year. So I don't think there's a big capital plan at this point. But given the council member hearing and a kind of push from a couple kind of sides on doing something with it, I think Parks Department will have to address it one way or another. We'll see how that happens. I mean, I would love to be the part of the conversation about the like email back, follow up on the whole. I mean, they were supportive. They gave us information. They shared drawings. They were like, go ahead and propose something, right? But who gives money for it or who creates a policy around it? That's maybe a separate issue.
My second part was when you were bringing up the areas that have been fenced off for quite some time and also pose potential dangers to kids and stuff, like I always wondered where the line gets drawn, and obviously it's shifted over time. And right now we live in a world where everyone's afraid to get sued, so they are very careful with stuff. But New York City has also like a lot of skate parks and things that people get injured a lot. So I'm wondering when you were designing how you addressed what could be repurposed, what might have to be rebuilt to new codes. How do you solve that issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's like literally for the property place.
Yeah.
So, we're not gonna be able to change the heights of the steps, but around the same time we were doing the redesign, I was actually in Europe and I was in Munich at the Olympic pool, which was open like year after 72, I think, or, around the same time. And I looked at the steps, I didn't measure them exactly, but I'm pretty sure they're not up to like current standards of, like safety codes. Of course, you could see a lot of modifications, railing added, some areas, like kind of not fenced off, but kind of like taken out of the kind of communication, some ramps were added. So I think it's maybe thinking of that. We're thinking circulation, we're thinking areas that are like, to walk on versus the areas to like kind of just sit on.
Yeah,
Maybe
there's-
playground is not a playground anymore, maybe you just, don't dedicate it to kids, or like those who are, more prone to like tripping. I don't know, it's just like stereotyping, but we did not redesign every step, and I know it's gonna be a big endeavor. I think it's possible, I think it's just also partially a kind of, a much closer study of how that would be achieved.
I don't know if that's a question or idea, but I sort of had two things in mind. When you're talking about the public spaces, I was actually pretty surprised at the number of public pools which exist in New York. But I was also a bit concerned about like funding public spaces, funding of maintaining it as a other thing. And I was quite taken aback by like the number of pools still being public, whereas parallelly public parks are having a struggling time because they're trying real estate and they keep getting used to enforcement. So maybe it would be interesting to look at the financial models of these pools if they can become independent of the parks program. Because generally, like pools are more or less becoming synonymous with luxury, and especially private pools. And I have a feeling that the public pools may go through the same thing that public parks, where you come from this prime real estate. So maybe it would be interesting to look at a part of the architecture renovation of it, if the financial model can be incorporated to these pools. And as a solution to the next phase of the research program, since you're talking about a lot of things, the information is there but it's not accessible. Maybe just an idea of if we can develop into an interactive map or where all of these public pools are available, but the information that a normal user need or the hours of use or where they are, whether it's open or cost.
It's on Parks Department website, so it's there, but it's maybe not, as like user friendly or however you want to call it. But budgets and operations are always a big discussion, right? And we reviewed that too. That's why we talked with Parks Department, because we didn't want to just like post something and like hope somebody's going to fund it or maintain it. And we know, the city's struggling literally with, basically staffing, pool to open it entirely with lifeguards, with other staff. So I'm very aware of that. But that's why I'm saying it doesn't take only a good design. It takes a kind of change of kind of thinking about public facilities as something that it's worth investing in, that it's worth using, that it kind of profits, everyone, and designing policy around it. Whether it's under parks or under other, department, I don't know. I was just presenting it also at the kind of Association of Landscape Architects conference on Friday. And there was a representative from the city, from the sustainability department, who actually became very interested, in seeing it in that format. Because information is there on Parks Department website, but once you see it mapped and kind of, like I also have the website that I made just during pandemic that kind of catalogs it. Maybe it's a little bit more accessible to kind of think about it differently. But, we talked, when the transportation department person was talking and they were presenting all this like pooling infrastructure, etc. I asked about pools and they were like, oh, pools are not our problem, pools are Parks Department. So there was also a lot of discussion about how addressing like heat, overheating issues, climate change issues, which pools are definitely part of hopefully solution. cross department, right? So it's not really under parks or not really under sidewalks or under something else, but it's a kind of has a separate kind of standing or kind of separate funding or kind of approach that we take. Anyways, this is like where everything is. If you ever want to go back, some of them.
What department was that person from?
That was transportation department, and the other person was sustainability department.
Because the beginning, when you brought up how the water is sourced, that's the Department of Environmental Protection, right?
I think sanitation.
So it's interesting because they do like have to, they like functionally rely on those other departments, but then.
Yeah, and like
Probably
water
right.
fountains are under parks, but they exist in the transportation kind of department zone, right? Like if you want to have a water fountain on like public street, that's like overlap of two agencies. I mean, this is solvable. This is really solvable problem, but I think right now it's a little bit siloed. And I understand there's regulations and everything, and yes, there's a lot of regulations about the if somebody you cannot have a phone. If you drop the phone and it breaks, they have to evacuate the pool, they have to drain the water, they have to refill it, those are the procedures. So, aside from somebody mentioned the kind of high kind of litigation levels, I understand why, there's so many rules around it, but there's so many to a point that like rules are like kind of hard to use sometimes. I'm kind of like going off. There's a couple I also did a couple kind of there's like historical images. This is the kind of fountain that was there. It's also like together with other kind of public funding. It was actually a beautiful model and stuff. Cut all of them. Types.
Probably difficult to assess, but do you know the volume of how much like in a summer, how much water this consumes?
Actually, I think it's publicly accessible information. Parks Department has their own kind of GIS data kind of set, and you can download how many people came to the pool they count roughly, like how many people came, when they were closed, how much water there is. I have all of that, maybe not from this year, but I can tell you.
Last 7 days or so, I think it was either Washington Post or New York Times. I saw a headline that said, "You don't know anything about how great public pools can be until you have seen the ones in." It was in France or Paris. It was Paris. And I just blew right by it because I thought, how great can a pool be? But maybe you have some insights into what makes, Paris's pool so great, or other European ones, because you mentioned in passing.
Yeah, I maybe tend to juxtapose those two approaches. I think every pool can be great. I think there's a little bit longer history of pools, like the floating pools actually kind of started in Paris, like 18th century, then they were actually copied in Boston and then in New York. So somehow, actually pools started as military facilities. Like if you look back, they're like Roman baths were also like, pools too, but then back to some other questions, like, I don't know, baths of Caracalla had a library in them. They were really like social gathering spaces where people would meet, they would have discussions, etc., etc. So I think there's just simply maybe a little bit longer history there of pools and water as a kind of public facility. I don't think that the Paris pools are like greater than New York pools. I mean, maybe architecturally there are some examples. Like my favorite pool ever is Bellinzona pool in Switzerland. That it's actually kind of a territorial structure that connects the city with the river, and it's a kind of elevated walkway, and then has all these like pools and sports fields around it. Very much not like an urban pool, but in any case, the article talked a lot about how people also like socialize there. That it's a kind of more an everyday thing. That some people swim topless, and that was like. possible. But like, I lived in Rotterdam and I went once to the pool, to the kind of spa/pool, and I was told like, unless I take everything off or out of the pool. So I think there's some like cultural differences, same with like, you know, sauna in Finland, you know. So maybe that's something that has to do with it. I mean, for me personally, I mean, growing up in Poland, like, public or, you know, communal things were kind of imposed or given. So for me, it was like very natural thing to do, to go to, everything was like public. I don't know, there was like, everything was free and public. So for me specifically, that was where I came from, and that's where I started kind of looking at how pools are working here. But I think that's totally possible here. I don't think it's maybe a little bit of a kind of mindset thing, maybe it's kind of understanding or putting value on things that are kind of shared. And that, you know, maybe we don't have a kind of specific stake or investment in them, but at large, they're very important facilities to have in the city and, you know, to make by the city, but also by every individual person. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
You do know that we have this incredible pool in Pain Candy.
yes, I went there too.
Upper floor,
Yes. That's the part where Moses was swimming to. He got his ideas from there. But I follow his steps.